How much do you remember from our episodes?
Oh my goodness. When they come back, we're record out a little bit over a month. When they come back, it's like an old friend visiting. And I don't remember any of that stuff until I hear it again. I go, aha, I remember that. How about you?
I think that's accurate. It's like watching a movie. I'll remember the major points and the emotional barbs, but sometimes I'll forget the details.
Well, we have this guy that writes these named Joe Anthony, and he puts so much information in an hour. It's hard to digest. Sometimes it gives me a headache.
Did you ever think that this show would qualify you to do anything?
No, just be rich and famous. Drugs and tigers.
If you're listening to the show, we are the Re-Engineered You, and we have been doing the show for how long now?
Just over a year.
Just over a year. At the end of every show, we say that we are not experts in anything, but we have an opinion on everything. But a couple of months back, I was talking to a good friend of the show. Her name is Mitra Shari, and you can catch her on the File Vine Fireside. She is the funniest lawyer in Oregon, and that's an actual title you can hold. But on her recommendation, I applied recently to get my private investigator's license, which in our state usually requires about 1,500 hours of investigation, meaning those who are applying for it are usually ex-police or lawyers or people who have spent time in criminal justice. Off the top of your head, just out of curiosity, can you guess how many of our episodes have delved into criminal psychology or court cases?
I would say 4 to 6 in that range.
4 to 6. Okay. It is closer to a few dozen. Not that the episodes themselves deal exclusively in it. Certainly not. But we have given enough presentations here and through our, also through, Toastmasters and talking about forms of storytelling, verbal priming, communication, also things that apply to juries. So I just wanted to share with you today, Todd, that because of this show and the way we present information, I have now had my background accepted as, I haven't taken the exam yet. There's a state exam for the legal portion of it. But my hours here and talking to other people and advising them on research we've done has qualified me for the PI exam for the hours.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was thinking a little detail we haven't covered on the show yet is little details. We haven't really talked.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
By giving your math here, I should at least be able to be a history teacher at a high school or maybe a community college, because I've talked a lot of history.
I encourage you to apply for those, or even better, walk in with a microphone to any history class you want. You have my permission, and just push the teacher aside and say, "Sit down, egghead, I've got this."
Joe and I use all of our content. We turn them into speeches. We turn them into breakout sessions. So this is not just episodes 1 and done. We use this information later.
Right. So I wanted to, if you're willing to indulge me on this episode, I want to talk about little details and how to memorize little details, how to see and recognize details. We're talking like there's a moment in Sherlock Holmes where he is wandering through his memory palace, quote unquote, in the BBC show Sherlock. And it shows numbers whizzing through the air. And like he is absorbing information, and he is viewing his data, the things that he has seen, read, and observed. It's all flying past him. And it struck me as bullshit.
The great Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah, okay, so there's also a show called CSI, Crime Scene Investigators, and they have something kind of similar where they'll have a freeze moment where they'll look at a little piece of evidence and the camera will zoom in really close on it, and then it will get microscopic. And of course, this is kind of how geniuses are portrayed in movies.
Laser focused, and they just lock on something. It all makes sense instantly.
Right, exactly. So I wanted to discuss on today's episode, if you're willing to indulge me, how do we memorize little details? How do we detect and inspect little details? And how do we, as normal folk, people who aren't trained for this, how do we take these memory tricks and apply them to our own life?
Now, having more attention to detail is going to help me what? It's definitely going to help me at work. Help me in all my relationships.
Yes, you may not remember when your girlfriend's birthday is, but you are more likely to remember the details of, what color she enjoys, or if you have a significant other who is very into something that you share no interest in whatsoever, you might remember a thing or two.
So what does a private investigator actually do?
I have no idea, but I really hope it involves investigating other people's bookshelves.
Oh, God.
You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Joe Anthony, the introvert.
And I am Todd Laments, the extrovert.
People seem to believe that CSI is real. In fact, there is something in law called the CSI effect, where it's harder for people who are gathering evidence, professionals, to convince folks who have seen CSI that they are limited in what they can do. We imagine that intelligent people can zoom in on tiny things, that their mind works like the camera zooming in on the desk to find fibers on it. Or we have anecdotes in research about people who have perfect memory. On the show, we talked about Mike Ross from Suits once. That is a character who has absolute perfect memory. He is able to read a law book and within seconds snap his fingers and recall any fact he needs from that book. And that is his superpower in that show. On today's episode, we want to bust 3 myths about memory and recall and little details. And you may notice that I'm using memory and details almost interchangeably, that I am talking about attention to detail and detecting things, but I keep mixing up memory with it, and there's a very good reason why. Little details and memory are very closely tied. It's not that you are being less observant when you don't see the tiny fiber on the desk that CSI is zooming into. It is actually that you have seen it, but your memory has decided not to write home about it. Myth 1. That is not how memory works. You and I are not data computers. Nobody recalls lists of information without a mnemonic device. But you do have one tool built into your brain that can write memory to your banks, and you have complete control over it. We're going to discuss that. Myth 2. And there are all these memory hacks we see online. We see speed reading, perfect recall, special forces training. So what works? What's the real hack to memory? Myth 3. So Sherlock is an unfeeling dick, yet he can memorize everything. But that's not how memory works. Memory actually requires us to have strong feelings about boring stuff. Have you ever listened to your college professor? A college professor really cares about 1500s opera or the price of tea of China during a Mongol invasion. So we're going to talk about why memory requires strong emotion. But first, I want to talk to Todd about our episodes again and how we build memory by baking it into narrative. Which of our narratives in past episodes stuck in your memory the most?
The very first one, Lord Byron and toxic relationships. And then also Toxic Relationships 2, a crazy story with Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra.
Right, them going out and shooting street lights and then having the cops roll up on them. And the cops are just shocked that it's these two huge stars, mega stars, who are just out drunk with a gun.
Or Lord Byron, this genius writer who was just a derelict, sleeping with everybody and drinking himself to death. What about you? What narrative just stuck in there?
Probably Anna Delvey. Classism, that narrative with her. We looked up how much time Affluenza Kid, who killed a bunch of people in his daddy's pickup, how much time he didn't do in prison. And Anna Delvey's about to serve like 10 years or something like that for basically conning a bunch of rich people. So one of them conned rich people and is going to do 10 years. One of them killed a bunch of people and is rich and is not going to do time. There's a reason we aren't just a study podcast. We could very easily come in here and just list out a bunch of facts and figures, or just have me have a list of like, here are 8, newer scientific studies that came out in the last couple of years. Here's how they can solve your life.
Bullet points boring.
Right,
like the
exactly.
Worst lecture you've ever heard. You tune it out. When you just get facts and we're the know-it-alls, you're just going to tune us out and turn us off.
Right, but it is so much more meaningful and memorable when we can put ourselves into these studies, when we can become involved and pretend, hey, what if I was going to court and it was because I had, conned some people? Or for Amazon and Walmart, do you remember how we covered their wage theft? How Walmart would ask people, could you stay over an extra hour and help us stack boxes, but they weren't getting paid for it.
Oh, I remember that. I also remember it took them 2 hours to even get to their workstation because of just endless security. So they're working 2 hours for free to secure their site. Also, they weren't allowed to go to the restroom. They'd have to take breaks, and they were lobbying just to get to be able to take their 15-minute breaks, but it would take them 15 minutes to walk to the lunchroom and back.
Right. Yeah, their break time was walking.
They play tag with a vending machine and go right back to work.
Right, exactly. So that's one of the memory things we're going to talk about is you have to be invested to learn something. We'll get into the science of this shortly. But that is the first thing we want to talk about is the reason we have our podcast structured the way it is to help build memory, that we do a narrative trick every time we do an episode.
I can tell you of all the business speeches I've ever been to, and I've worked for big corporations, and we have the keynote speakers with these breakout speakers. And let's take it, any book you've read that's nonfiction, what do you really remember about it? You'll remember one story. And you'll say, it's a great book. It's when they'll say, what's it about? And all you'll be able to rehearse to them is that one narrative.
Here's the story I remember. Here's the lesson I took away. And hopefully people remember the lesson part and not just the narrative. And that's a really good way to start this out. If you want to remember something, like if you are trying to be a super brain, you're trying to be a TV detective, or you're trying to be Sherlock, only expect yourself to remember a fact per story. And it can be a very, very, very short story. It can be extremely simple. This is called, by the way, episodic memory. Yeah, over the course of the show, we're going to talk about different types of memory and how to use them to basically become Sherlock Holmes. So our first type is episodic memory. If somebody came out of a bank and they had just robbed the place, and they ran out, they held up a gun, told you to get on the ground, and then they stole something very odd. Like they have a bag of money, and just on their way out, they take the little pen on the chain, they rip it out of the counter, and then they run away with the money and the pen. How much of that event do you think you would remember? Like, would you be able to describe the person to the cops or the gun to the cops?
I think the one thing I'd remember would be the pen thing.
If I asked you to think about your first kiss, how vivid is that memory for you?
Very.
Very. Okay.
Things that are really emotionally tied. Funerals, breakups, getting fired from work.
Okay.
I feel like those are, I can imagine like it happened yesterday.
Do you remember on our alcoholism? By the way, I'm going to bring these things together in a couple seconds. I'm not just like asking a bunch of disconnected questions.
What kind of cheeseburgers do you like?
Do you remember the alcoholism episode? And we talked about how addiction can be tied sometimes to a nervous amygdala.
Stephen King episode.
Oh, yeah. So the reason I'm asking all these questions, episodic memory and emotionally charged memory basically is a tie between the amygdala and the hippocampus. By the way, Todd and I really want to stress here, we are not experts in anything. We're not neurologists. This is our looking things up online and slowly trying to digest it. So if you want to look at our sources later, I highly suggest it. We got these from good sources. In the bank scenario, the pen would stick out to you. You didn't answer the gun.
Oh, should I? The gun and the pen are the two things I'm going to see. The weird thing that they did and the thing that could end my life. The fear and the...
No, I just thought that was interesting. So in police statements, usually when people are faced with questions, the things that you'd think they remember the most are oftentimes the things they forget.
Well, I remember there was a really good TED Talk, and it was about why eyewitnesses are the worst witnesses.
Right, exactly. Oftentimes they are emotionally charged. It's easy to verbally prime them. Like if you say, how fast was the car going before the crash versus how fast was the car going before the bump, people will overestimate a quote-unquote crash by about 10 miles an hour or something like that. Memory is a very tricky thing, and the more emotional charge you bring to the table, the more flexible it gets and the more memorable it gets. So the way episodic memory works, to my understanding, is that your amygdala, the nervous part of your brain, the part that's in charge of helping you regulate emotion, it helps write memories to the hippocampus. The way there's a book called Unfuck Your Brain, which is all about like addiction and anxiety and the way they interact. She talks about how the amygdala is basically it's like a Richter scale. It is writing the emotions. It's using emotion to determine how bold a line it writes to the hippocampus, how much it scratches those lines in, those memories in. So if the Richter scale is high, like if you have a lot of emotions involved in the moment, like a bank heist that you're a witness to, or if it's like a crash or a fight or something, your amygdala is going to be firing off really high, but it's not necessarily going to be accurate. It's going to be scribbling a lot of black lines like an earthquake is going off, but it's not necessarily going to pick up on the most important things. One of the things that people forget frequently during a police interview is the gun. They'll forget what it looked like or what model it was, or they'll focus entirely on the gun and they'll forget the person behind it. They'll literally not be able to recall the face.
I could do that. It was a 5'10" white guy that looked exactly like you.
You look like both of us. But we want to talk about how to hijack that system. So if your amygdala, if its job, I mean, this makes sense for hunter-gatherers, like for early man, we want to remember things that are going to affect us. We want to be able to If you were like...
Yeah, the fear flight thing is a lifesaver.
Right. All this is actually built to help you. People are like, why can't I remember everything? This is upsetting. It would be so much more upsetting if you could remember everything.
Well, I've thought about that because, what's the old saying? Things get better with time. If we remembered every time we had our feelings hurt, and it just started piling up.
Oh, it would kill you. Yeah.
The depression would just put our lights out.
Yeah, or if you are actually Ross from Suits, the show, and you can remember everything you've ever read, how much junk have you read that you didn't want to? Like how many end-user license agreements or website agreements, or how much like legal stuff have you let drain out of your memory?
Or our William Sidis episode, a man with an IQ 100 points higher than Albert Einstein was absolutely miserable because he was so smart.
Right. So if you can remember everything that you read or everything that you see when you walk into a room, you are going to hate your life. It is far better to hijack or use episodic memory. So if you are going through something and studying and you need to remember it, give it emotional weight. Give things, if it doesn't have emotional weight, invent it. Literally make it up. When I think of Gottman and Lieb's golden ratio, that study about negative expressions, that you need to have 5 positive for every 1 negative to have a healthy relationship, I remember that because I remember a negative expression is sending bloody pubes in the mail to your lover as a threat.
Lord Byron.
Toxic relations. Yeah, that was a his lady love sent him bloody pubes in the mail.
That one stuck with me because not the pubic hair one, but the 5-to-1 ratio. Anytime I'm a jerk with my wife, I immediately think I need to do 5 things right. After I apologize, I think I'm behind right now, 5 count.
Yeah. That is the best way to remember facts and information. Give it a narrative.
And the pain of it is my ex-marriage, my last marriage that ended, my relationships that ended. And I think if you keep being a jerk, you're going to be in the Lonely Carts Club again.
Right. Yeah, if you are below that 5-to-1 ratio, I can think back on not just dates, but like people I have been friends with, and if I'm below that ratio, you don't keep that friendship very long. So when we are in our hypothetical detective scenario, and we walk into a room, and we're trying to remember everything we possibly can, and then we go take a nap. Say if we had to memorize every little detail of what's on the table today, do you think you'd be able to remember where the pen is, where the plug is, what's plugged into the USB plug, like all these little things?
Definitely not. That would be filtered out of my brain. And after the long, hard day I had today, it's hard for me to even remember how to spell my own name.
Right. I remember the example people usually use is, can you remember what you ate for breakfast yesterday? And I found one study case of a person who had perfect memory. They could remember everything that happened to them. It was autobiographical memory, perfect autobiographical memory. They could remember everything that ever happened to them. They were extraordinarily miserable. They hated their life. Like their brain was broken. Because a healthy brain forgets what's on the table. A healthy brain will sleep, and then like literally the act of sleeping helps you eject memories and used like lit neurons that aren't going to be used again. It helps those sort of fade back.
But don't the dwellers and the grudge holders, aren't they the most miserable, physically unhealthy, mentally unhealthy people? And those other people just seem to let it wash off their back
right,
and move on. Not miserable, happy, well-adjusted.
I think of this as like an Etch-a-Sketch, that you have a cloud of neurons in your head. They have lots and lots of different overlapping circuits. And to make one stick out, to make memory effectively, we have to highlight a circuit by using it. And then the more times we highlight it, the more times we have lightning go through that part of the circuit, the more it brings, like if it's an Etch-a-Sketch, it's iron filings. So it brings those metal filings up. It raises them until you have a clear picture, and that circuit can be used. Every time you use it, it's easier to use. And when you sleep, it makes everything around it fade. In our Grudges episode, we talked about how you'll build a memory of somebody who has hurt you, or you'll build a memory of the other side politically doing something outrageous, morally outrageous.
Or a narrative about how they've ruined your life.
Right, exactly.
Over and over.
Yeah, they voted somebody in you didn't like. They enacted some law that you hate. And so you just keep hitting it over and over again. You hit that circuit. We even the episode, we call it a circuit. And it very much is. When you activate a circuit, when you have this sort of lightning go through your Etch-a-Sketch and draw a line, repeating it over and over again makes it stronger. And like when we talked about your first kiss, Todd, every time you access that memory and you have an emotional charge with it, you change the shape of the memory.
Bonnie Fraser, my first kiss.
Okay. Shout out to Bonnie Fraser.
That's it. That's how clear I remember it.
Yeah, when you access that first kiss memory over and over, you might as well have your fingers on the knobs of the Etch-a-Sketch. And as you go through that memory, you expect it to be delightful and amazing and shocking. And the more you access that memory with that emotional charge, the more you're going to embed it with those emotions. So the memory in the actual events, you know, with Bonnie Fraser, you might have felt awkward a little bit. You might have had something interrupt you midway through the kiss. You might have had, you know, all these very minor negative things happen. It might have been uncomfortable. Your underwear might have been riding up. You might have had a rock in your shoe. Eventually, those things will fade, and only the positive will remain, because every time you access it, you will only be giving electricity, literally charge, to the good parts of the memory.
So it's not more accurate because you put human emotion in it. It's just a lasting feeling. You romanticize, you make it the good out of it.
Right, exactly. So that's what we're advocating. If you want to remember every little detail of something, give it an emotional charge. It doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to have the fact involved in it. If I tell you that the bank robber took a pen, and that's the thing that you remember, then that is the thing that I would suggest sort of clinging to and giving it charge. One of our episodes, we talked about MacArthur Wheeler, who put lemon juice all over his face, thinking it would make him invisible. I'll never forget that because it's so bizarre. It let me have an emotional charge. Him being that ignorant is actually what I remember. Okay, so the last component to memory I want to discuss. We've discussed how you need to bring an emotional charge to the table. If you're trying to remember facts about Napoleon, it helps to get mad at him for being a manipulative dick. If we're talking about memorizing things that are kind of boring, like episodic memory, or like Sherlock's memory palace, there is actually like real stuff we're going to discuss soon called spatial memory. But before we get to spatial memory, I want to talk about memory that relies on arguments. There's a YouTuber who does a physics channel called Veritasium. And he wrote his college paper, his PhD thesis, on how arguments make it easier to remember facts. So if you're ever trying to remember something that's difficult, or like it's difficult to remember, like a law, or if it is uses a lot of like data, statistic, dates, basically stuff you would memorize in college, it's easier if it turns into an argument. When you hear an argument, you subconsciously start picking a side. Do they... by the way, I don't view people who are into sports as lunkheads and jocks. Sports is so dense and so difficult to remember for anyone who's from the outside. Not only is there like plays to remember, the way things are set up, each sport is different, but statistics. There's so much sports is statistics.
Well, and on the arguing thing, I listen to podcasts that are sports talk radio. But my favorite is ESPN. All day long, they have these talk shows with these very aggressive sports hosts. And a lot of them are ex-journalists, and I've followed this. They've been in the business for 20 years. A lot of them are Ivy League educated. Mundane things that happen in sports. I'll give you an example. They'll be talking about what a quarterback's feelings are about his coach, or how good a teammate that he went out to dinner with a certain offensive lineman and what that meant.
Right.
And then these guys will have this extreme views about how they're best friends and they're going to win the Super Bowl. And the other guys will be like, it means nothing. It means they don't like each other. They try to create all this conflict, and they're so either extreme one way or extreme the other way that they get to the point that they're yelling and cutting each other off.
Right, they work themselves into a froth. I didn't understand that for a really long time, why everything became an argument. And sometimes, on very rare occasion, if you're watching sportscasters who are bad at their job, you can tell their argument is like shallow, or they don't actually care what they're saying. So that's kind of how from an outside observer, that's how I judge a good sportscaster from a bad one. The good ones actually sound like they're arguing a point.
Well, they're getting a lot better though, Joe. Their stuff, they have a thing that goes into their ear, and it's scripted, and it's premeditated, and it's over the top to get our attention.
Right.
And once you kind of taught me about this stuff, I'm starting to notice, because I would get mad at these sportscasters, and I want to, reach out to them and tell them why they're wrong. I'm getting myself emotionally invested in a team and a sport I don't even care about.
Right.
So how are they getting that raise out of me when I have my own job, my own life?
Right. They're arguing about like the frisbee tournament that like nobody cares about, and you're ready to yell at them and tell them they're wrong.
Yeah, my blood pressure's raising.
Right.
And now I realize that's why they're doing it, because I keep watching, wanting to be outraged.
Yeah, suddenly you remember what teams are playing because you've picked sides. You're like, no, like Tampa Bay, they're the person arguing for them was right, so Tampa Bay is right.
And then I watch a really good game, and I'm curious about what they're going to say about it later. Who cares? I already watched the game. Game's over. The players don't care.
Yeah, but it's kind of like me checking the forums. You want to know what people thought, and it's important to have been right. Because if you watch a game, you know how you felt. If 10 other people feel the same way, then you're validated. You had the right opinion. This is important in the real world. Just to very briefly bring it back to like private investigators. If you don't remember, a car that was owned by the brother of somebody you're following, they might borrow that brother's car and pull up behind you while you're like casing a place and like pull out a gun and threaten you. So like little detail memory, when somebody is wrong and somebody else is right, that is a very easy trick to use to like to latch onto details, to hook yourself into something. There's something they do in Game of Thrones. And I remember a writer called it sexposition, where two people will be in bed together. And that show is just, it's nonstop sex and violence if you haven't seen Game of Thrones. But there are so many world details to memorize. King Baratheon of House Baratheon had his father was a nobody, and he won this battle at this, the details about every side character has, a whole house history. And it's incredible how you can memorize so many characters and their histories and what they are about because you watch them have sex and have an argument. That your eyes are busy, you're titillated, and somebody in this room is wrong and they're both naked. Like, you could not get a better memory trick than that, than to be picking sides among two lovers. You don't necessarily need to do that in your own life to memorize things, but it certainly helps to put stakes in. If you're reading about something in history, choose a side. Choose the wrong side. You'll remember the heck out of that. We had an episode about the Hitler Youth episode, and we made the argument that, if you don't think you would have been in the Hitler Youth, you would have totally been in the Hitler Youth because 90 to 95% of youngsters were. It was mandatory. So if you choose a side and you just for fun argue the wrong side, hypothetically, not like you're actually having a conversation every time you crack a book, but by God, you will remember it if you just build an argument for the opposite side and then argue yourself back down. So we started this episode by teasing or talking about Sherlock Holmes and his memory palace, that he visually sees math equations floating through the air, and he sees facts and figures zipping by, and he, in the show, he holds up his hands and he bats facts out of the air, like he moves them around with his hands. We want to talk about like spatial memory, photographic memory, visual memory. And Todd, by the way, Todd and I both went to a guy, Joshua Foer. I went to his TED Talks, which is about how he won a Memory Masters championship for fun. This is a researcher. This guy is not like a memory expert, or he's not born with a photographic memory. He just wanted to see if anyone could learn it. And then you came back. I said, hey, I saw this 20-minute video. And Todd was like, I read the book.
The one time, and it is a dense, thick book, and it's all about your brain, and it's all about your memory, and I learned so much from it. The book is named Moonwalking with Einstein, but the TED Talk is called Memory Masters TED. Now, he was a journalist, and he literally went into this not to compete, but just to study and find out if I could remember more, I would be more powerful, I'd be more intelligent. Makes sense, right?
Right. If you can recall things with especially sharpness, you're seen as intelligent.
He started to study with these people, and then he started to pick up their little tricks and mostly patterns that they have, and then he entered the contest and won it. It's a very boring spectator sport, by the way. It's a bunch of guys sitting in a room with headphones on and memorizing thousands of numbers in a row and remembering them.
Right. Their activities are not like shot put and long jump and things like that. They memorize stacks of cards, like they'll turn them over slowly and memorize the order. They will memorize huge lists of numbers. They will memorize, chess positions.
Well, the big one for me, and what I did after I read this book was, how many times have you heard someone say, I'm horrible with names?
Right.
It gets old, right? Everyone's horrible with names. But if you work at it, and what trick I started doing was, if I meet somebody, I try to pair them up with a name. If their name's Mick, I put them with Mick Jagger. Whoever the most wild are, if it's Ted, I do the serial killer Ted Bundy. Something extreme. Or I put them in a bucket of people I already know, someone who's very dear to my heart. And I'll put them in that bucket. And that helped me out remembering names, and I became good with names.
Yeah. Have you ever seen, did you see the movie W, which was Josh Brolin as George W. Bush? He has a moment in there. I had to look it up because I wanted to make sure it was true. So there is something that George W. Bush used to do. Like it made me think he was less, I kind of think of him as a dumb president.
Oh, I remember this one. You talking about the college one where he's drunk and he can memorize everybody's...
Exactly. He memorizes every name in the room, and he does it because he uses a mnemonic device. Like he pairs their name up with a rhyming thing, like Dan the Man or something like that.
And that's the patterns. That's exactly what Joshua talks about in his book. Who do we see as just being geniuses that we look up to? Don't world-class chess players fall into that?
Yeah, we look at that and we say, that is the real life Sherlock, of course.
What they're good at, Joe, is memorizing chess patterns. When you get them off the chessboard in regular life, they're no smarter than you and I.
Right.
So the point of that is we're all brilliant in our own lanes.
Right. If you don't think you already have a brilliant memory, just think back on whatever you did for work and what you had an argument about. If you argued with somebody at work about, if you're a mechanic and you argued about what muffler was on somebody's car, if you are in clerical work and you argued about what cover sheet was on, a document, you will remember so much more than anybody else who is outside of your field. So you have these skills. You just haven't applied them to other places in your life.
But what you're talking about with the filter and how dull things are and how important it is to filter out dull things where we go crazy. A lot of his teachings is to make everything outrageous. The more outrageous, people streaking through your living room, Britney Spears dancing on a table. The more extreme, the more emotional you get it, the more likely you are to remember it.
Right. And I will remind everybody again, this is like memorizing a series of cards. Like I watched in one of his videos, he's flipping through a pack of cards. And he is like, when he's like imagining the Queen of Hearts, he's imagining a celebrity like Britney Spears. And then when he sees the Jack come up after that, he's like, and the Jack stabbed Britney Spears with a knife because he's holding a knife on the card. So like, it gets wild. It's like he's building his own short Game of Thrones soap opera. And that's how he's memorizing it. So the next time we have a really dense fact-based episode, can I send you just a bunch of made-up bullshit like that? Like soap opera style?
No, please don't. I have enough hard time with your notes.
Without me convoluting with a bunch of fictional nonsense. Okay, well, you remember the facts how you want to remember it, and I'll remember it with,
I'll remember
crazy.
How they really happened, yeah.
Okay, that works for me. If you want to take advantage of your ability to make memories, hijack the episodic system by putting yourself into conflict involving the subject you're trying to learn, and the spatial system by putting yourself in the physical location. Use this literally to learn anything you want and be as dramatic as you want about it. It's okay if you completely fabricate things that are happening, if it's helping you memorize little boring details that otherwise wouldn't be interesting. I accidentally got a PI license from the show and from my study about story and narrative. But I just want you to know this isn't an irresponsible backwards falling into this. I do not intend to sit in a hot car all day and take pictures of fraudulent medical claims or stalk cheating spouses. I intend, if I can, to use this for lawyer assistance, as a researcher, and I may even look into the Innocence Project and look into a couple of cold cases. Again, I'm not going to claim to be anything I'm not. I will purely do this as a researcher. But I want to say this is all thanks to doing the show with you, Todd, going through and realizing how interesting these things are, how interesting everyday life is when I pay enough attention, when I live in the now, and I actually absorb what's happening around me. Because as this process has taught me, life is really awesome when you pay attention to it, and when you get enough sleep to actually shake that Etch-a-Sketch back to normal.
You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, and blog articles for each of our episodes. We also appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.